Okay. Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our Yom Ayun. This year, we're combining sort of, if you want to say, our Hanukkah and our Christmas Yom Ayun into one. But we're doing the evening, December 24th at night. As I think there's some other name they often call this. And of course, tomorrow, beginning at 9:15, a total of 9 speakers. And it's a pleasure to welcome Rabbi Dr. Moshe Miller. We'll get to him in one moment, who's making his debut for Torah in Motion. But I first want to thank our sponsors of the program, Jack and Marla Samuel, and Bob and Sharon Silberstein, both here in Toronto, in honor and in loving memory of Mrs. Grace Weil, Bracha Caleb at Lippman Aryeh, beloved mother-in-law of Dr. Esther and Heshi Sturm, also here in Toronto, and Rabbi Aryeh and Sarah Weil, who I believe live in Israel. Devoted wife of Mr. David Weil and Savta and great grandmother to many, and Yizak Reb Baruch, and thank you. And I always say that the best way to memorialize somebody is through Torah. We live in a temporal world. The eternal world is the world of Torah, and with that, we're looking forward to a meaningful evening and day of learning Torah. And with that, we'll welcome Rabbi Miller, or Dr. Moshe Miller, who got his PhD in modern Jewish history from Bernard Revel Graduate School of Yeshiva University. He is associate professor of Jewish history at Touro University's Graduate School, and as you just heard, Lander College for TJ is Lander College for men and for women. And for tonight, especially, we will comment that he just released this year, University of Alabama Press, his books, Samson Raphael Hirsch, Religious Universalism and the German Jew in Quest for Emancipation. And he will be speaking tonight on Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch and attitudes towards Christianity. So, Vakasha, Rabbi Miller, a pleasure to have you. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Kelman. Thank you for graciously inviting me. As you know, this was not your first invitation for me to speak, although it is the first time that I said yes. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity. I also wanted to just give a thanks to Dr. Mark Shapiro. I don't know if he's here, but I wanted to thank him for some of you will be staying on. Hopefully, all of you will be staying on to hear him speak after me at 8:45. But I want to thank him for his support in many different ways. Speaking of Touro, so I teach at the Women's Division of Touro in Manhattan, and I finished teaching my last classes of the semester yesterday and today. Tomorrow and Thursday, I give final exams. So why am I saying this? So yesterday, I completed teaching one of my classes. It was halakha. It was a class of Jewish law, and we confirmed, our final exam will be tomorrow, December 25th. So a young lady came over to me, one of my students, and said, "Rabbi Miller, how can Torah do this? They're scheduling because it's a Torah class. They're scheduling a Torah exam, a final exam in Torah, the day after Nittel Nacht. How could that be? We can't learn. We can't learn. You can't study Torah Nittel Nacht. You can't study Torah on Christmas Eve." So I said to her, "Listen, I'm a Litvak. For me, it's not a problem." I said, and the folks that run Touro are probably also Litvaks. It's not a problem for them either. You apparently will have to overcome this issue. You'll have to find a way to study for my halacha test tomorrow morning on the night of Christmas. Bringing this to our topic tonight, as we all know, tomorrow night is the first night of Hanukkah. We're lighting the Hanukkah lights tomorrow evening, midnight tonight, and December 25th is also Christmas. And so I would say it's fair to say for most American Jews, certainly for non-Orthodox Jews, the convergence of Hanukkah and Christmas is generally seen as a great boon, a great blessing. It's fortuitous. It's fantastic. We have the holiday season. We have the lights of the Christmas trees. We have the Hanukkah lights, and what could be better than having the two overlap? I even saw something recently about a new term that was coined in Chrismaka. A new term, Chrismaka. So one of the papers. So yes, this is in fact the widely held view, and we often, and this is including among the Orthodox, we often talk about Hanukkah. It's the great festival of religious freedom. The great heroic Maccabees fought against the tyrannical and intolerant Greek oppressors who didn't grant us our religious freedom to worship God as we saw fit in our temple, and we overcame them, we vanquished them, and we celebrate this. We celebrate religious freedom. Okay. The question is, can we really frame this from a classical Torah perspective? Our attitude towards Christianity, towards Christian holidays, even Christians as people. Can we frame it this way? Across the board, there's a consensus, meaning across the board within the Orthodox world. There is a consensus that we have to have good relations, we have to have peaceable relations with non-Jews. We don't want there to be pogroms. We saw what that was like even just recently in Amsterdam. It wasn't state-sponsored, but that's basically what it was. We don't want that. So we have to be nice, we have to get along, and so we could be nice to our Christian neighbors and so on. It's okay. And really, the rabbis of the Talmud, the Chazal, speak about this, Mishum Eva, due to animosity. You can give greetings to non-Jews on their holidays, even idolatrous holidays. Okay, but I think Orthodox Jews in the 21st century want to be able to engage with other humans who live on this earth along with us as fellow people, as fellows. People, we want to engage with them, and this is really two pieces here. It's to recognize the humanity of the other and to recognize the spirituality of the other. The world that has billions of people with a B, and more than 99% of those are not Jewish people. And many, not all, but many of those people are people with spiritual strivings. They also want to seek out transcendent meaning, and many of them want to connect to the Creator, to God, to Hashem. How do we view them? Okay, so sometimes we have to do this incrementally. So sometimes what you'll hear is, well, okay, so Hashem created everyone. This is what you'll hear in certain circles in the Orthodox world. Hashem created everybody. Hashem, God made everyone, and therefore everything has purpose. Okay, that's true. God did create everyone and everything has purpose, but God also made spiders. And when you see a spider on the wall, if it's bothering you, you just smash it. It gets in the way. We understand that the spider is subservient to a person, certainly to a Jewish person, and so you can just dismiss it. You can get rid of it if it bothers you. Clearly, then just framing it as, well, God made non-Jews too, and therefore they have a purpose. Okay, we're getting somewhere, but we have a ways to go. We, of course, as Orthodox Jews, when we develop an approach to this issue of how we relate to the other, and how we develop respect for the other, as we want them to have for us. We don't want them just to not kill us, not to do a pogrom against us. We want them to respect us as fellow humans, as people who observe the Jewish faith, and have our holidays which we observe, and they should respect us for it. That's what we want, right? Well, there has to be some reciprocity, right? It has to be a two-way street. When we do this, when we as Orthodox Jews do this, we have to be faithful to our classical texts. That's what makes an Orthodox Jew. An Orthodox Jew is that we have a tradition, we have Masorah, we have the written law, and we have the oral law, and these texts are binding, and we have to take them seriously. We have to grapple with them. We can't look at a text and say, "Oh, that's just outdated. I'm just going to skip that one." We have to relate to the text. So when examining the issue that we're discussing this evening, we have to recognize that the views of non-Jews, and we'll get to their religions soon, but views of non-Jews, there's two, you might say, I don't know if hurdles is the right word, but I mean, there's two issues that we have to address, that we have to tackle. We have to tackle two issues before we can make any progress. One is in the halachic realm, the realm of Jewish law. And the second would be in the realm of Jewish thoughts, hashkafa, ideology. In the realm of halakha, we have some serious issues we have to address, okay? So there are rabbinic texts that are recorded in all the classical sources. You have the statement, for example, the Talmud, Masechet Avodah Zarah, Chaf Vav Amun Aleph, the bottom, 26a towards the bottom, it continues on 26b, Chaf Vav Amun Beis, Hagoyim, in the old text, I mean, the present text will say Ha'akum, but the uncensored text, Hagoyim lo malin lo maridin. You don't raise them up out of the pit, and you don't put them down into the pit. So, I mean, you can't kill them, but if they're in the pit and they're begging you to save their life, you don't save them. You don't save them. Why is that? So this is discussed. The Gemara itself discusses. The Rishonim, the medieval commentators discuss this. The issue could be just localized to idol worshiping idolatrous non-Jews, and so maybe we shouldn't assist people that are engaged in idolatry. It's like we're assisting, we're promoting, promulgating more avodah zarah, more idolatry in the world. I should also note, mid-thought, when I say idolatry, idolatry is not the best translation of avodah zarah. Avodah zarah is the halachic term for the kind of worship that, of course, we cannot engage in. But as Rabbi Dr. David Berger has correctly noted, think about the words. Avodah zarah literally means foreign worship. So to say idolatry, it doesn't have to mean worshiping an idol, a statue. It means the worship, the recognition or worship of an entity as God, who is in fact not God. Okay, so that's what avodah zarah really means. So so the Talmud says you shouldn't save these Gentiles. Let's say it means idol worshiping Gentiles because you don't want to promote idol worship. Okay. Some say that it's even an issue even if they don't worship avodah zarah. Some say that it's just an issue of lo tichanem. It says in Sefer Devarim, don't show favor to the other nations, and if you show favor, this is a biblical level prohibition, and that maybe would apply even to non-Jews that do not engage in avodah zarah, and that really broadens the scope of our problem. We have other statements, and I'm just going to cite one because this is still cited to this day by certain segments within the Orthodox world. If it wasn't cited today, I wouldn't talk about it in this class. But you have the statement of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Toiv shebegoyim harog, the best of the Gentiles is to be killed. Now, this is cited, it's in various places, in the Midrash Tanchuma and the Masechet Sofrim. There are several places in rabbinic texts in which this passage is found. But the Bali Tosafos, the Tosafos, on the passage of the Talmud, where it says, don't save the Gentiles when they're in the pit, and don't kill them, the Tosafos asks as a question, what do you mean don't kill them? Doesn't Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai say that the best of the Gentiles is to be killed? And Tosfos say, based on what the Talmud Yerushalmi, Jerusalem Talmud says, well, that statement really refers to a time of war. Then we say the best of the Gentiles is killed. It's not a time of war. We don't apply that principle. So these are harsh statements. I'm saying this now because there was a book in Hebrew, you can call it a sefer if you like, Torah HaMelech. It is I think it's just really an awful book. It's written by rabbis in Israel. It was published, I think, about 15 years ago or so, roughly speaking, around 15 years ago. And the work is basically, it is purportedly a discussion of the Jewish laws of war and how we should treat non-Jews in a time of war. But the author is basically, they go on to dehumanize non-Jews in general. Killing a non-Jew is a minor misdemeanor. It's maybe only a rabbinic violation. And that's even if it's not during war. And if they don't keep the Noachai laws, then it's even worse. It's even less of a problem. And if it's during war, then you can kill them for sure. And you can even kill the children, because the children are going to grow up to be a problem. And, these are unpleasant truths, but these are things that people are saying. Now, thankfully, the work Torah HaMelech, the book that I'm referring to, is basically at this point a marginal text. When it was first released, it received some letters from great rabbis that praised it, but then they had to retract it, and so at this point it's pretty marginal. But there's an ongoing war in that region, and we want to always remind ourselves of how we don't want to interpret Torah, not just how we should interpret it, but also how we shouldn't. So we know that these rabbinic texts are there. They're part of the canon. They're there. We have to know how to relate to them. Now, I think probably the best guide towards this particular issue in the medieval period is the Meiri. Rabbi Menachem HaMeiri, one of the great medieval commentators on the Talmud, who lived from 1249 to 1316 approximately. He wrote a classical commentary on the entire Talmud, Beit HaBechira. So he uses a very interesting term. I want to see if I can share that for you just for a moment. In his commentary, share the screen for a second. I hope that everyone can see this here. Okay, so the Meiri on this and his commentary, this is the website is Ala Torah. It's a great website. The Meiri's commentary on this passage where the Talmud says you don't save Gentiles, you don't save them. So he says you have to know which kind of Gentile are we talking about. We're talking about the pagans, the evil pagans. Which kind of evil pagans? Says Meiri, it means those kind of pagans that kol aveira v'chol keor yafa beineim. Every sin, every degenerate act was beautiful in their eyes. It's those evil, wicked pagans, those kinds of people who engage in all the worst kind of abominable practices. Those are the people that one shouldn't save. And he quotes what he calls Rosh philosophy, which may be a reference to Aristotle. And I'm not going to read the quote, but you see it in Hebrew, it's here. And then he says, but the non-Jews of today, and this is the Middle Ages, it doesn't mean now, it means in the 13th century, when he lived, he says, non-Jews that have some connection to divine worship, some connection to Ovdei HaLakut, some connection to the worship of the divinity, even though they're not among our faith, they're not included in this law. Chalila v'chas, says him here. He says, perish the thought. He says that non-Jews that are not wicked pagans are not included in this category. So we see that, yes, we have the rabbinic text, but we also have the rabbinic interpretation. And that's already in the Rishonim. This is already the Meiri. Okay. So we see that the halachic text can be understood. They can be explained, and we'll come soon to how Rabbi Hirsch does this. But I want to first note, first of all, was there someone had a question? Okay, yeah, these are just very good resources. I hope everyone checks those resources that are in the chat. Let's go back to our analysis. We said that there's two issues that have to be overcome in treating how we can relate to other human beings, the rest of mankind, the people that inhabit this earth that aren't the Jewish, how we can relate to them in a respectful way. So the first issue we said is halachic. The second issue is ideological, it's ashkafic. There's long been a debate. I think it's probably a debate within the Chazal among the rabbis of the Talmud and Midrash, but certainly among the Rishonim, medieval authorities, and those that follow them. There's a debate between what I call the particularists and the universalists. Now, the particularists, to say that the particularists stress what is particular to the Jewish people would be a gross understatement. Even the universalists, even the greatest universalist of recent years, the late Rabbi Sachs, he was a great universal thinker. He spoke about mankind and he loved mankind, and even he tended to focus in his writings on the unique needs of the Jewish people. Most of his books were written for Jews about Torah topics, his essays on Chumash and so on. So the debate between universalists and particularists in Jewish thought is not a debate between people who think we should stress Jews versus stressing the world. Everyone stresses the Jews. The question is, when you relate to the wider world, how do you view the rest of the world? Okay. And there are some striking passages here. We probably won't have time to read all of them, but I'll just draw your attention to two sources that I think are worth just pondering. Excuse me. You have the great Maharal Prague. The Maharal, in his Sefer Gevurot Hashem, Maharal says the following. He says that the famous Midrash, which is also the Talmud in Masechet Avodah Zarah Daf Gimel, right, the Chazal, the rabbis teach us that God offered the Torah to all the nations, and they all declined it. Our people, by contrast, the Jewish people, we said Nasa and Ishma, we were doing here. We accepted it. The Maharal says, well, we don't really find that God actually offered. Where did we find a prophecy? Was there a prophet that went to the nations and offered the Torah to them? We don't find this happening. And therefore, the Maharal has a striking reading of this text. And he says that God did not literally offer the Torah to the nations. It didn't happen in a literal sense. What it means is that God looked at the nations and he saw that their essence was not fit to be recipients of a Torah. They couldn't take it. They're just not ready for it. Because as the Maharal develops a typology, and this is throughout his writings, consistently throughout his writings, there's this typology of the nations of the world. The nations of the world, they are drawn to all the chomer, to all the physicality, to all the tava, to all the lust, and so on. Whereas the Jewish people, we are spiritual people. We are drawn to what's holy and pure. So the non-Jew is drawn to the impure, and the Jew is drawn to what's pure and holy. And that's the Maharal's typology. And so the non-Jewish nations couldn't receive the Torah because they weren't fit to receive it. But the Jewish people was fit to receive it because we're elevated. Now, this approach of the Maharal is clearly based or rooted in ideas that the Kuzari, Rabbi Levi, and Kuzari discusses. That I'm not going to go into right now, but this is clearly a basis for it, as are many Kabbalistic works as well, which I'm also not going to go into, but just noting that there is this school of thought. None other than the Ramchal. I'm switching from Maharal to Ramchal. Maharal lived in the 1500s. Ramchal lived in the first half of the 1700s. And the Ramchal, these are both great Jewish thinkers, and we all study their works, and we all should study their works. But so we come to these particular passages that we sometimes have to ask how are we going to understand this? The Ramchal writes in his Sefer Derech Hashem, the way of God. He discusses the meaning of the revelation at Sinai. What impact did that have for the wider world? And the Ramchal states that when God gave the Torah to our people, he offered it to the nations. So the Ramchal, unlike the Maharal, he assumes that there was actually an offer made to the other nations. Do you wish to take this Torah? Do you not wish to take it? And Ramchal describes that as sort of like a last chance of sorts. Let me see if I can bring it up. I want to show you a couple of his words of what the Ramchal says about the revelation at Sinai. Okay. So you can see here, this is Rabbi Kaplan's translation of the Ramchal, which was the Ramchal's book Derech Hashem, which was written in Hebrew. This is translation. So at this time, God also gave the nations a last chance. In his mercy, he had suspended their final judgment until the time the Torah was given. He then offered the Torah to every nation, giving them the opportunity to accept it. If any nation would have accepted it, it would have elevated itself from its lower state. So he says that based on this idea that the Avos, the patriarchs, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, they passed down this elevated spiritual state based on ideas of the Kuzari. They passed them down to their children, the 12 tribes, and then the Jewish people have this more elevated spiritual state. So the rest of the nations don't have this state. But they still had a chance. The other nations had a chance to obtain this state if they had accepted the Torah. As it was, says Ramchal, none of them desired the Torah, and their judgment was therefore sealed completely. The gate was permanently closed, never again to be opened. So the gate of reaching great heights of spirituality, that's what he's referring to, was closed on the rest of the world. After Har Sinai, thousands of years ago, after that event of the giving of the Torah, the rest of the nations, the gate was closed, never again to be opened. He says individuals can convert to Judaism, but of course we don't go around proselytizing, so we're not looking to save their souls, as some religions do. So he says in this section here, he said they could convert, but we don't see converts. So the bottom line is that the majority of the world is never going to be able to reach a high level. And he goes on to say that they're still given their Shema. He does say that they have a soul, they have a divine soul. He stresses that it's a lower level, but they have the divine soul. And they had their 7 Noachide laws, which is, he says, appropriate to their nature. Okay. And he says in the world to come, that the only nation will be the Jewish nation, the souls of righteous Gentiles will be secondary. Okay. He goes on to make another assertion, which is really quite bold here. This here, towards the end. God thus made the rectification and elevation of all creation totally dependent on the Jews. The whole tikkun ha'olam, the whole rectification, the whole spiritual rectification of the world, to bring the world to a more perfected spiritual state, he says, is entirely dependent on what Jews do. That is to say, that which less than 1% of humanity does, that the fate of the spiritual fate of the world is entirely contingent on them. And what the rest of the world, the other 99 point whatever percent of the world does, what they do, it doesn't affect the spiritual state of the world. So in the entirety, I think, just as an example, I think we can say, I believe the population of Australia, just to give a simple thought experiment, population of Australia, I think is something around 26 million or something, and the Jewish population is much smaller. But if the entirety of Australia, that is to say all the non-Jews that live there, if they all were influenced by a great spiritual teacher, a non-Jewish spiritual teacher, who convinced them to keep Noachide laws and to serve God and to be elevated and to be spiritual, if they all became pious and upright Gentiles, if all 26 million Australian Gentiles became righteous Gentiles, but not Jews, the Ramchal says that that dramatic changeover in the life of 26 million people would have no effect on the spiritual state of the world. Only what the Jews do have that effect, not what the Gentiles do. So you have to understand that when we're talking about attitudes towards non-Jews and their religions, we have halachic sources that we have to address, and we have the ideological text as well. We have the ashkafic sources. Now, I have to stress at this point that we're going to segue to Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, the focus of the discussion, basically at the halfway point, but that's what we'll focus on going forward. Rabbi Hirsch was not developing a new Judaism out of whole cloth. He didn't invent something in the 19th century that no one had thought of before. Right? Rather, what he did was he drew upon precedents that existed within classical Jewish texts, that is, halachic precedents and hashkafic, ideological precedents. He built upon them. There's a strain of thought, a strain of halachic thought, a strain of ideological thought that he built upon, and he further developed. And he developed a coherent and a systematic approach to these issues. So among medieval authorities and among other authorities, by no means is the position of Maral or Ramchal or others of that school of thought the consensus position. The Rambam's position, Professor Menachem Kellner has demonstrated this, I think, beyond any reasonable doubt. The Rambam's position was that the Rambam, Maimonides, was the universalist. He basically believed that what makes Jews special is our religion, our service of God, the way we serve God. That's why we're special. It's not the DNA; it's the way we lead our lives. And so Rambam famously writes in the laws of Shemitah and Yovel in the 13th chapter. The 13th law, he says that any inhabitant of planet Earth that devotes themselves entirely to God, any human being, that's the way the Rambam says, any human being that lives on planet Earth that devotes themselves entirely to God and the service of God, says Maimonides, that person becomes God's special portion and becomes Kodesh Kodashim, holy of holies. So says the Rambam that any human being that is devoted to the divine service can be considered holy of holies. Okay. So and that's one idea that I think is important to bear in mind when we're thinking about Hirsch. Broadly speaking, when we move away from the particularistic school of thought to the more universalistic school of thought, okay, there's probably two key biblical texts that are really, really essential to the universalist school. One of those is in Shemos, in Perek Yutes, Book of Exodus, chapter 19, just before Matan Torah. God characterizes the Jewish people as a Memlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh, a priestly nation and a holy nation. So that's seemingly redundant. Priestly and holy. So priestly means to be holy, like priest. So there's various ways of interpreting this, but Maimonides Rambam, as his son Rabbeinu Avram, quotes them. And also the Sforno, Rabbi Abadi Sforno, they say, among others, they say that no, what it means that when it says that the Jewish people are Mamlechet Kohanim, a priestly nation, it means that our relationship to the rest of the world is like that of priests to lay people. Anyone that's a pulpit rabbi understands you can't hate the lay people. You can't hate the congregants. You love the congregants. They pray in your synagogue. You care for them. You want them to rise up to be as good as they can be. You care for them physically. You care for them spiritually. And you're the spiritual leader. You want them to look up to you. They'll ask you questions. But the point is that it's a relationship of mutual respect. Okay, mutual respect. So once you have this notion of the Jewish people as a priestly nation, as Maimonides, Sforno, and others understand. So now we're on our way towards Hirsch's position. Likewise, we have the other verse, probably most quoted verse in all Tanakh, in terms of the topic of today's discussion. That is in the Yeshaya, in Isaiah, Perek Mevav, chapter 42. Or goyim. God says, it doesn't say or la goyim. It says or goyim. But in any event, let's assume the meaning is roughly the same. God says that the Jewish people is to be an or goyim, is to be a light to the nations. And in fact, Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, another of the Rishonim of the medieval authorities, he says that the Jewish people are supposed to inspire the rest of the world spiritually. The pasuk, the verse previously refers to the Jewish people as being a bris am, the covenant of the people. Radak says, what does it mean that we are a covenant of the people? It means that people there means people. Radak says that we bring peace to the world. It means physically, we bring peace to the world in a physical sense. And spiritually, we try to inspire the world to believe in God and observe the Noachide laws, the universal Noachide laws. So you have these biblical verses, and these are real texts, and these are classical sources among Rishonim and medieval authorities that understand the Jewish people are a priestly nation. We're also a light onto the other nations, and that is our vocation. That is almost, you could say, our raison d'etre. That's our reason for being. It's why we're here. We're supposed to be this type of a nation where our spiritual lives will serve to elevate the spiritual lives of the rest of mankind. It is here we enter Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. The circumstances of Rabbi Hirsch's life in the 19th century Germany, in many respects, resemble that of 21st century Jews. If you live in, say North America, I know Kalman is in Canada, I'm in the US, but if you live in a Western country like the US or Canada, the rights that we have in these societies, of course, we have even more rights than 19th century German Jews had. But the idea of the Jews being a religious minority in a essentially Western society in which the majority of the inhabitants are not Jewish, and we do our own thing, we lead our own life, and we have to try to live with respect for those that are around us. The first time this really happened was the 19th century, because prior to the 19th century, prior to the process of emancipation, the process by which the Jews of Europe received civic rights, prior to that, they didn't have these rights. They were not considered as citizens. Okay? And so only in the late 18th century, with the French Revolution, 1789, 1791, French National Assembly, the first time that Jews of Europe are emancipated, other European states follow, Holland and Great Britain, and Germany and Hungary and others. So once Jews begin to be emancipated, they receive the rights of citizens. The main critique, many people are not aware of this, the main critique on the part of non-Jews who were opponents of emancipation, those who felt the Jews should not be emancipated, perhaps their main critique was the Jews are tribalists. They only care about their own kind. Why would you emancipate these people? They're not going to benefit us. They're going to benefit themselves. They only care about their own kind. And of course, they quote these kind of Talmudic passages that we just spoke about. That seemingly are harsh. Right? So this was a claim, and when there were debates between supporters of emancipation, those that supported granting Jews these rights, and those that did not support, even among non-Jews, those that supported it and those that did not support emancipation, one of the key topics which was debated was this question of: are the Jews overly tribalistic? Do they only care about members of the tribe, or do they care about the wider world? If they're granted the rights of citizens, are they going to use these rights to benefit the wider society? Or are they going to just look after themselves? Okay, so ultimately, Jews were emancipated. The pro-emancipation view that the Jews will care about the wider world, right, came to be the predominant one. That's at least what the laws reflected up until the Holocaust. So the Jewish thinkers, and I'm focusing on Rav Hirsch because Rav Hirsch was the leading spokesperson for Orthodox Jewry. If you were in Western Europe and you lived in the 19th century, the leading spokesperson, the person that you would turn to see what does this person say about what does Judaism teach, what is Orthodox Judaism as opposed to Reform. There were other denominations that were developing at that time, but what is Orthodox Judaism, the term that eventually came to be used over the course of that century? What does Orthodox Judaism say about all the issues of the day? The person that would be the main spokesperson for the Orthodox Jewish point of view would be Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. Just like in the last 20 or 30 years or so, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs he had that role. So too Rabbi Hirsch had that position in the mid and late 19th century. And Rabbi Hirsch in his writings consistently stresses, probably more so than any thinker prior to him, the universalism at the heart of Judaism. He also stresses that the Jewish people are to be a priestly nation. We have to be a priestly nation, and the reason why we were selected is not because he rejects the view that the other nations were rejected. He rejects the view, Hirsch rejects the view that when the Torah was given to the Jewish people, God thereby rejected the spiritual potential of other nations. He expressly rejects that view. He doesn't cite Ramchal by name, but he rejects that view. I actually want to show you, again, a short passage of where Hirsch does this. I'll show you, you'll see the context of how he does this. How does he reject Ramchal? He doesn't cite Ramchal, but he still rejects it. He rejects that view. So here, I have too many screens open for my own good, but let's see if I could, this is the one. Okay, so this is the, everyone sees, right? I'm screen sharing a text from, which is a thumbs up. You see Vayikra, right? Vayikra, Chaf. You see that? Okay. So the verse here says, this is at the end of Parashat Kedoshim. It says, Va'abdil eschem min ha'amim liotli. So God says, and I've separated you from the nations. It doesn't say I've separated the nations from you, but I've separated you from the nations. So Hirsch here cites a midrash in the Yalkut Shimoni, which the Chazal teach that had it said I've separated the nations out from you, there would be no hope for the nations. Had it said I've separated the nations out from you, there would be no hope for them. Because it's like someone that's choosing fruits, someone that's picking apples, right? The people that clear away the bad apples, the workers in the store that clear away the rotten ones, those are gone. They're not being sold anymore. They take them away. But when you pick apples, you pick the best one first. You pick the nicest one, you put it in the bag. You pick the next nicest one, that goes in the bag too. So if God had said, "I separated the nations from you," that would then mean that He rejected them. But instead, it says, "I've separated you from the nations. I've chosen you first. You're the first nation that I've chosen, but not the last." Okay. That's what Hirsch says. It says we see, and that's what Chazal says. That's the midrash. So Hirsch says, so that in no way does Jewish thought look on the choice of Israel as a rejection of the rest of humanity. They regard the choice of Israel only a beginning, only the restarting of the spiritual and moral rebuilding of mankind. Only the first step to that future, where he quotes this verse in Zechariah, where many nations will flock to God and they will become His people, because that's the messianic vision, right? The messianic vision is where all nations will serve God in unison. Many nations will attach themselves to God and become His people. And Israel's sanctuary will not only be the central heart of Israel, but the center of mankind who will have found their way to God. Okay? So you see here, this is really quite a powerful idea here. Here you see a clear rejection of the particularist view, the view that the revelation of the Torah at Sinai marked the closing of the sealing of the gates for the other nations. Hirsch says, on the contrary, it marked the beginning of a new phase of human history where there will be a model nation that will serve to regenerate the spiritual potential of the rest of mankind. That's also, by the way, Hirsch, it's on the sheet. I just didn't not have time to read it inside, but the verse in Shemos in Perek Daled, in chapter 4 of Shemos, when Moshe is told to speak to Paro, Moses is told to speak to Pharaoh, he's told that the Jewish people are B'ni Bechori Yisrael. Israel, the Jewish people are my son, my firstborn son. So Hirsch says, why are we being analogized to a Bechor? Bechor is the firstborn child. Well, Hirsch says the Bechor is the child that opens the womb. The child in halacha, the Bechor is the child that's born through a natural birth, through the womb. So the Bechor opens the womb to enable the other children to then go and pass through the womb. So the Bechor is not the one that is free, but the one that makes free. The Bechor opens the womb that enables others to come and join his ranks as children. So too the Jewish people are the first nation that join the ranks of being servants of God, but our purpose is to open up the womb, as it were, of mankind, so that the rest of the nations can take their rightful place as servants of God as well. And so when we get to rabbinic statements, that we all know this, right, from the very beginning of Rashi on Chumash, where it says "Bereshis" in the beginning. So one of the drashot, one of the Hamlaic interpretations is "Bereshis" is read as "Bishvil Reshis," on account of that which is Reshit. What is called Reshis? The Jewish people, right? B'shvil Yisrael, right? Rashi brings down from the Chazal that the world was created. The world was created b'shvil Yisrael, on account of Klal Yisrael. Now this can sound rather particularistic. The world is created for us, so what's with everyone else? They're shopliver. So you could say that means that the rest of the world they're there to serve us. Right? We're here to serve God, and they're here to serve us. But that's not what Chazal actually say. They just say it's on account of Yisrael. So Rav Hirsch says, when he cites that passage of Chazal, b'shvil Yisrael, on account, the world was created on account of Israel. And actually, by the way, the Netziv also was a contemporary, the great Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin. In the 19th century, the Netziv, he says the same thing. They both say, Rabbi Hirsch and the Netziv both say that when the rabbis teach that the world was created b'shvil Yisrael, it means that the world was created for there to be a model nation called the Jewish people that will then rejuvenate the spiritual capacity of the rest of mankind. Okay, so we have the sense of how the Jewish people can have a rather open approach towards non-Jewish spirituality. Now, what about the halach issue? Are Christians considered to be worshippers of avodah zarah? That's how we start a discussion with. So, well, they worship an entity. They worship a Trinity, which includes an entity that they consider to be God incarnated, which we do not accept as such. So, are they considered to be over there by the Zara? Are they guilty of that crime? If they are, then their halachic status would be quite different than if they were deemed to be monotheistic. Now, there is an important passage of the Rishonim in the medieval authorities, the Tosafos, and several other Rishonim refer to this as well. This idea that when it comes to non-Jews, what's called shituf, literally partnership. Okay, non-Jews are not forbidden in partnership. Now, this text, if taken literally, taken at face value, as many achronim, as many later rabbis did take it this way, that this is basically saying that the Rishonim, Tosafos, and others are basically saying that there are two standards of monotheism. There's one standard of monotheism for Jews. We have to worship God and God alone. Bilti l'Hashem levado. Okay, only Hashem alone. No other gods together with me. But that's for the Jews. That's a commandment given to us. But non-Jews, they have a different standard of monotheism. They can worship the one true God, the God of the Bible, as Christians and Muslims do. Of course, Muslims don't have any partners. They just worship the one God. But Christians worship the one true God of the Bible. But they also worship someone else along with them. And if non-Jews worship the one true God, and along with the one true God, they also worship a different entity, which they mistakenly associate with God, that's not a sin for them. That does not impugn the monotheism that it is expected of non-Jews. This is obviously a very attractive position, because then we could preserve the strict monotheism that we as Jews need to maintain, but we can still respect that non-Jews, especially Christians, can be deemed monotheists, even though they don't have the exact same theology as we have. So this is a passage that's found in medieval authorities. There's a lot of debate about this. This is for a different class, different day. But perhaps Dr. Shapiro will discuss this in his forthcoming talk about Hinduism. But in any event, my point is that many of the later authorities did assume, even though it's debatable, but many of the later authorities did assume that the Tosafos, that the medieval authorities were saying that as we just said, non-Jews have a different standard of monotheism. A non-Jew, a Christian, can go to church and worship in a church. They can worship the Trinity, including Jesus, and as long as they also believe in the one true God, that's partnership, it's shituf, that's allowed for them. Which means that instead of seeing Christmas as being a night when there's full of impurity, it's so impure we can't even study Torah because there's so much tumah, there's so much impurity in the world because the idol worshiping Christians are worshiping their religion. We can see it rather differently. We can see it as other human beings who developed a faith that's based on our faith, that's been inspired by our faith. The Hebrew Scriptures, that's part of their Bible, is the Hebrew Scriptures. They call it the Old Testament, but that's the Bible, right? They developed this faith on the basis of ours. And maybe we could just share with you one last text before we have to wrap up our discussion for today. Hirsch is very strong on this. He really speaks very powerfully in a very positive way about other religions. If I could just find that which I highlighted for you. Give me 1 second. Here. So here you can see, this is from Horeb. This is Hirsch's Sefer HaMitzvot, this book about the mitzvot that apply nowadays. He's discussing intermarriage with non-Jews and the various rabbinic laws that are related to that food that's cooked by Gentiles. And in the midst of his discussion, look what he says here. He says, well, first of all, he says, don't think that these foods that non-Jews cook, bishul akum, it's not unclean. He says that would be ridiculous and absurd. But aside from that point, which is important to keep in mind, he says right here, Israel can rejoice today in the midst of the peoples amongst whom it mostly lives. Behold, Israel, how the holy light which God placed among you at Sinai has spread far and wide, and has already scared away from a great part of humanity the delusion and the abomination of idol worship. Rejoice Rejoice, says Rav Hirsch. Rejoice, he says, not just be tolerant, but be happy. Rejoice that in Europe, in America, and in part of Asia and Africa, obviously he's referring to the places in which Christianity and Islam are the predominant faith. That's why he says these locations. Rejoice that in Europe, America, and part of Asia and Africa, non-Jewish peoples also have become illumined by the revelation of the one God given to you, and have adopted a doctrine which teaches them to perform the 7 duties which, according to your doctrine, are binding on all men, meaning the 7 Noachide laws. And the first of those is to worship no idols. So he's telling us clearly that Christianity does not run afoul of the prohibition on worshiping false gods. Christianity is sufficiently monotheistic for Christians, for non-Jews. And so we have here a model in which we can appreciate and can respect the people amongst whom we live. They are the majority, and we can talk about their holidays, and we don't have to talk about it with disdain. We can talk about it with respect, and we can say that we have our path to serving God, they have their path to serving God, and we are closer. Historically we've had a closer relationship to Hashem, of course. And there's a concept of what Chazal described as Kedushas Yisrael, the holiness of the sanctity of Israel, based on, of course, acceptance of the mitzvos. But this does not put down in any way non-Jews, and does not negate the viability, even the desirability of non-Jewish religions, if they're, of course, interpreted properly. Hirsch was not naive. He was aware that Christians and Muslims had, and as we've seen now in some cases with Hamas and groups like that, sometimes use their religion to kill us, to attack us. They do that sometimes, but that's not correct. That's not the way those religions are supposed to be. They're supposed to be a source of commonality between Jews and the adherents of those faiths, and it's supposed to bring all of humanity closer to God. And hopefully we will see more and more of the world full of the knowledge of God, as the prophet says, like the world should be full of the knowledge of Hashem as the waters cover the sea.